Okay, good day, and thank you to all of those who've joined us. My name is Patrick Donovan, and I'm a Senior Director of Marketing at Udacity, where I help the Udacity team improve access to the type of AI skills training that the current and future era of AI demands. I hope you're as excited as I am for today's conversation with, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say, one of the top minds in AI right now. Joining me is Dr. Richard Socher, the co-founder and CEO of U.com and co-founder and managing partner of AIX Ventures. Richard previously served as the Chief Scientist and EVP at Salesforce, and before that, he was CEO and CTO of AI startup MetaMind, which Salesforce acquired in 2016. Richard received his Ph.D. in computer science at Stanford and is widely recognized at having brought neural networks into the field of natural language processing, inventing the most widely used word vectors, contextual vectors, and prompt engineering. He is, I believe, the fourth most cited researcher in natural language processing and has over 215,000 citations. In addition to all those accomplishments, he's also served as an adjunct professor in the comp sci department at Stanford. Richard, welcome and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Very impressive biography. Really excited to talk with you today and hear a bit about what you have going on at U.com and about the world of Agentic AI, which is primarily what we're here to talk about.
Excited to talk about it too. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Most folks watching already, I like to believe, already know a thing or two about Agentic AI, but just so we're all starting from the same place, maybe you can set the stage for us. What's your sort of elevator pitch on what Agentic AI is and why it's important?
Yeah, Agentic AI in many ways is the next level of neural sequence models. A lot of us have looked at neural sequence models for quite some time. And neural sequence models generally don't care too much about what kind of sequences they're learning over. And if you have a lot of example training data, then you can eventually have those neural sequence models predict next follow-on sequences. So what do I mean by this? Well, they're very large neural networks, and you can train them on sequences of tokens. And those tokens can represent amino acids of proteins. They can represent chunks of words for English. They can represent chunks of characters for Python. They can present notes for music, and so on. When you include in these sequences of tokens, action tokens, then we often call them agents. And so agents essentially do not just predict the next English word in a conversation, but they can also predict the next action you might want to take, like click on this button, actually try to book this flight or program something and then actually execute this code, which is one of the most powerful, of course, actions you can take on a computer is programming something and then executing that code. That means you can do all kinds of amazing things. And so we started to call them actions, and they're also trained somewhat differently. It's a little more technical, but instead of just predicting next tokens in a sequence of actions and words, you often can allow these models also be trained with reinforcement learning, where they can explore, try out things, and then get feedback from humans or automated simulations and systems. And so there's a lot of potential for this line of technology, and that's why a lot of folks are very excited about. At the same time, there's also some hype, and it's not quite there yet, and we can dive into that today.
Yeah, I do have a question on that front coming soon. But I think I first want to further clarify, how would you distinguish this category of AI agents or agentic AI? What is sort of its clear distinguishing factor from the rest of AI or generative AI? Like, what makes it uniquely distinct such that we're talking about it as a category unto itself?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just taking actions, right? Which robots have taken for a while, but never quite in a very generalizable way, in generalizable environments like the whole web or my living room or something like that. I do think it's also exciting in that AI used to be either sort of a completely sort of separate system, like weather forecasting or something like machine learning statistics that just continuously runs but makes sort of short-term predictions at every time frame. But to have very complex workflows be automated by an AI is something truly novel. And I think we're sort of in the second stage of three stages. The initial stage of Gen AI was just sort of autocomplete and shorter things like finish this little function for me, write like the next paragraph in this text for me. Now we're getting more and more towards agents that will do work that may have taken you days and you can do it within hours, especially in knowledge work that we're working a bunch on at U.com too. And these knowledge agents are real. They're happening right now. And then the next level for agents would be to take work that may have taken weeks or months and have it be done in days. And then agents are becoming more and more like people, and you have to think about onboarding them. You know, even if you had an amazing intelligence, you'd still need to onboard them and be like, this is the process we do inside this company. And this is how we generally answer those kinds of questions, or how we work in our code base and things like that. And so agents are exciting because they're both here already for some use cases, and the potential to really change all of intellectual labor is immense.
That preempts my next question, which is you kind of already alluded to, there's a lot of hype. There's an insane amount of hype around all things AI these days. And it feels like in the past few months, maybe year, agentic AI specifically has entered that fray. And I think I'd like to understand from your perspective what's sort of utilization we're at in terms of the potential of agentic AI. What I like to refer to as in the wild or in production. To what extent do you feel like we, society collectively, individuals or businesses, are currently utilizing the utility of AI agents? Like, where are we on that journey?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two types of agents, right? They're like action agents, and then they're knowledge agents. And knowledge agents are here. Like, we've had our customers on the U.com platform created over 90,000 agents already that will do knowledge work for you. And the actions that they can take are mostly around searching for more information. If they're not sure yet, they have everything they need. Doing deeper dives in sort of the Wikipedia rabbit holes we used to go into before we went into U.com or ChatGPT rabbit holes and conversations, would be like sort of going through links, right? And the AI is doing that for us now and bring that back within a chat interface. But then also doing programming, running statistics, going through CSV files, writing Monte Carlo simulations, running them, and then giving you an answer based on those results. So those kinds of capabilities are here with knowledge agents. Where we're not quite yet are what I would call action agents. And in many cases, I'm very certain that they will come. It's just that very few companies have enough context for a person to be able to do it. And we haven't seen enough sequences of actions that include booking a flight in training data. No company has had, a browser that would actually literally track everyone. And most people wouldn't want that. I was like very tempted to try Anthropic's computer use, which is an action agent, right? But I just can't get over the idea that a screenshot of my screen gets sent somewhere outside every couple of minutes. It's just like, I have so many confidential, databases and like customer data, and how is that related, like compatible with SOC 2 compliance, and like all these things that you need in enterprise context that I just can't actually install these kinds of tools very easily. And many people feel like that. Many companies are like that and very worried about the security of all the action sequences of all their employees. And so no one's collecting much data, and data is often a useful leading indicator for where I can go if we want it to do that. And so long story short, action agents where someone says, oh, I want to go to London and book a trip with my family of 4 and 1, 2, 3, and it's done. That is obviously overhyped and not a real demo when you see something like that, because most companies, especially startups, don't have the context to really get to that last mile. And then the demos you see of like, oh, I can order a burger through a chat interface. Turns out it's usually slower to type in, yes, choose the salad, and just click on like, yes, salad, in an interface. And so a lot of companies have built interfaces to make it very easy for humans to do this. And then you think, well, I want the action agents maybe to automate things at a massive scale. And then you get into sort of spammy issues, and Cloudflare will block you. It's already blocking OpenAI's operator on the web. So there's a lot of complexity, because as we could have more AI agents surfing the web than people in the next few years, we would then see a massive disruption on the advertising model of the web, because agents are not going to click on ads when you ask them to book a flight for work to New York City. They're not going to be like, ooh, Bahamas, maybe we should go there in the summer, and fly over there. Like, it's just a different way of working with the web, and that will kind of put pressure on. But these kind of human incentive systems are another issue for these action agents, and they will slow them down a little bit more, and it won't just happen like next month.
Yeah, the book travel for me feels like somehow the classic example that has emerged. I don't know what that says about our current creativity socially, but I do want to hear, what examples do you see that are working? Like, what are some areas where you feel like either, and maybe it's enterprise grade and that's fine, but like, where do you actually see like this few folks or a few companies have figured this out? I don't know if you can name names or what, but just curious to understand where you've seen like, yep, this is actually working. These folks have the context and they're doing it, and they're sort of helping us figure out how to do it.
Yeah, we see massive adoption in consulting. That's a really big one. We have a lot of folks in the big consulting companies that are using U.com for its accuracy and compute capabilities, and also research mode, like writing a full PDF for you that you can send around, that you can manipulate, and getting like slides prepared for you. And those kinds of knowledge work are perfect for AI, especially for accurate AI. A lot of people can like quickly hack up a prototype, but to really have one where you can trust it, where the citations actually work and so on, it's a whole different beast. And so consultant is a big one. Financial analyst is another really big one we see a lot of adoption in, hedge funds, venture capitalists, and so on. But then we also provide APIs in U.com to other consumer companies for both search and answer capabilities, and they incorporate those now into their own products.
Got it. And I want to take that into more or less our main topic for the day, which is trust and accuracy in the context of agentic AI. And I think there's a few different angles from which we can approach this question. I actually want to start from the perspective of the AI developer or product manager, or even yourself, the people actually building AI agents. Maybe a overly simplistic question, but how do you know when an agent is ready for public use? Like, what is, and we can get into specific KPIs and metrics that I'm sure I don't even know the names of, and I do want to go there, but I just want to start with that sort of basic frame of like, how does your team figure out, yeah, we can turn this loose?
Yeah, there's a lot of testing that we do, and maybe even too much. Some other folks just like launch stuff, and it's like, here's a financial dashboard, and then like every company has like a $5 trillion market cap, and it's like all the numbers are made up, and I'm like, I would have been embarrassed launching that. But yeah, so the sort of threshold depends on different companies and their risk appetite, and their sort of how consumery they are versus enterprise. In enterprise, you really have to be accurate. Consumer, if you hallucinate a little bit here and there, it's less controversial or consequential in many cases. Like people asking, what's the score of the game? You get the score wrong. It's like, okay, no one's going to die or lose their job from not knowing the right soccer or football score. But so you have to do testing, and there's different levels of testing, right? There's sort of sub modules that can get tested, just like the search should be very accurate. And that's a whole, complex subsystem that a lot of people forget about. Like the search infrastructure we're now providing for some LLM players, a big partnership with Databricks we just announced this week, for instance, where all the LLMs on Databricks can actually get web search connectivity. These are examples of submodules that are themselves, billion-dollar businesses and very complex code bases and so on. And LLMs are in many cases garbage in, garbage out types of systems, right? If you ask an LLM what's new with Trump, and it retrieves articles from 7 years ago, puts those into the prompt, and then summarizes them for you, the answer is not going to be very useful, right? LLMs don't have a great conception of time and what the time currently really is. So you can add all of that into the prompt correctly in a system, but if you don't use that system well and it doesn't give you the right search results, then you're not going to get the right thing. So you can evaluate these various sub-modules. How often should we have implemented something in code and then actually did, and the code ran and didn't have like a syntax error and never return any useful results. You can put all that together and then individually evaluate these modules. Then, of course, you can and should have human evaluators. There's a lot of excitement around those this week with the big Scale.ai sort of half acquisition, I guess. And so you have to use people to evaluate and ideally real users on real queries of how they like the answer. And you can actually get benchmarks. And we've done this actually in our research mode, for instance. We compared our research results that are like longer 20-page reports to those of OpenAI's deep research. And a level below humans, you can actually ask AI also to evaluate other AI outputs. And so in particular, O3 is a very powerful model. And in order to really scale this up to thousands of different long 20-page research reports with like 500 citations and so on, we actually asked an LLM judge to say which of these research reports is better. And so the OpenAI O3 LLM judge actually judged the research reports from U.com to be much higher quality than those of OpenAI. And so that is another layer that you can automate more. And then you get to that human layer I previously mentioned. And then you can get to actually having evaluations deep inside the product where you have thumbs up, thumbs down, and feedback mechanisms that users can give in that moment. So yeah, those are the main things. You start with the sub-modules, then you start to automate full answer quality, usually with AI, and then you get to people in an offline benchmark, and then you get to continuous evaluations after that.
Are there specific, I have to imagine there's a host of terminology of which I'm not familiar, but what are some of the specific actual terms in KPIs? I bet some of your teams working on this are actually looking at certain different types of scores across a rubric. I'm just curious what some of the actual metrics and KPIs are called and how your team thinks about them.
Yeah, so there are some simple objective metrics. For instance, numbers of citations, right? We did that number and across the whole data set and all the answers of RA versus OpenAI, for instance, we just found we had 162 citations on average and OpenAI has 45 citations on average. And you can look at unique web pages where we had 78, OpenAI has 15, or unique domains, we have 58, OpenAI had 13. So those are kind of examples of just objective metrics you can track. And if you say, hey, this is a deep research capability, it should really help a consultant to be really up to speed on a complex question, then the more is just better, right? So that's one. Then there are benchmarks where you look, in one cases, for instance, you can look at the scores of a data set called Frames that was published by Harvard, Google DeepMind, and Meta. Stands for Factuality, Retrieval, and Reasoning Measurement Set. And there is a question of how often did you actually get to the right answer? And the right answer often requires you to do multi-hop reasoning. You might ask things I'm just making this up, what was Michelle Obama's cousin's college or something, right? And so you might not see that answer on just Michelle Obama. You have to actually go in and find her siblings and then their children, and you have to kind of do multiple hops of reasoning. And so then how often do you actually get to the correct answer? And in this case, like, RA, for instance, got 80% of the time to the right answer. And this is all open source, which is, I think, a really important aspect here. Like, you can claim all kinds of evaluations and accuracies, but you need to actually show open source benchmark data sets and publish the code, which we all did. And then you can see how, it's much more accurate than like DeepSeek and GPT-4o with like search preview or Perplexity, all these other things. They're like all way less accurate, almost half as accurate. So those are sort of academic benchmarks. And then in our case, where we said we should have a more realistic one for real work that like actual consultants and financial analysts really do. And there we looked at a win rate, where you basically ask the LLM judge across different factors, which one is better, this one or that one. And so there's an overall one, there's a sub component of following instructions. There's one on how comprehensive is the answer given that prompt, how complete is it in terms of really capturing everything, and then just looking at the writing quality, right? So you can kind of define, based on what your company cares about, different metrics, and then compare and ask either an LLM judge or a human judge which one is better.
I want to call out, you mentioned in there, Ari, for folks listening who may not know, Ari is U.com's deep research agent, possibly the world's most intelligent deep research agent. And I think that's a good example. I mean, you just talked through it, but I really want to underscore, when we're evaluating different agents in the work output, there are these very objective mechanisms that your team has worked on, that other teams have worked on, to figure out what it means to be most intelligent or most accurate or most something else. I think there's a very interesting question around benchmarks here, because benchmark by definition means this has been happening for a while and I know what people before me have done. In the AI world, benchmarks are very novel. Like, you might be working on technology where the benchmark does not exist and you are the person setting the benchmark. How does that dynamic play out amongst yourself, other academics, other founders and entrepreneurs in the AI space? How open is the environment such that you can actually figure out, like, are you able to go to other researchers and other business founders and say, hey, here's what we're seeing from our deep research agents. What are you seeing? Do you find it's particularly open? How's the climate and comfort level around establishing those benchmarks?
Yeah, like, it's actually highly variable. Like, some companies are really good about understanding how important benchmarks are for evaluating AI. Others are just like, here, 3 examples, and it didn't work on like this example, and so that's harder. You then have to say, all right, well, when does it work and when does it not work, and how do we evaluate things, and how much does this matter versus that? So in general, like, every company that's sophisticated enough to have a benchmark data set, we win those deals over the competition, but there are not that many that have that level of sophistication and have an actual benchmark set on which they can evaluate. There's a whole company, right, with Kaggle back in the day to help companies set up such benchmark data sets to some degree. And then once those companies have those benchmarks, then and actually work on this, there's also a lot of sort of complexity in actually getting adoption for those. So what we now started to do is actually have role-specific training certification as part of U.com, where you can learn how to actually become not just a simple prompt engineer, but eventually a prompt engineer that creates agents and real workflows that will do more and more complex work for you. And so that's another important aspect of agent rollout, is actually enabling everyone to become a manager of AI. We're all going to essentially work at high levels of abstraction, where you will delegate more and more work. If you're a manager and you're doing something that's very repetitive and maybe not as exciting, you usually in the back of your mind say, all right, I should now delegate this workflow to someone else because I've done it too many times now. That kind of thinking is something we should all have soon. And I think in the next few years, if you do the same thing over and over again in any kind of software, you're going to ask, like, why hasn't this software taken over this workflow yet? And that's when agents are a complete reality for more and more people. And at some point, it's going to be similar to saying, oh, I'm not good with this computer thing, which some older folks said, 20, 30 years ago. Like, is a similar thing to be like, I'm not very good with this delegation to agents. It's just like not acceptable if you want to stay in the workplace.
Yeah, and I want to revisit that in just one second, but I want to first go back to some of the remarks you made around submodules. And when we talk multi-agent systems, and I'm sure it's highly variable, but I just want to get a sense of how many agents are we talking about interacting on a given task or in a given environment? Like, is it 2? Is it 20? Is it 100? And in some of the words you were sharing got me thinking, like, we probably have QA agents and then QA agents for those agents. And like, there in theory could be infinite layers of that. And so maybe just paint the picture of like, what is the landscape in terms of number of agents and how many are acting, how many are safeguarding, like what does that look like?
Yeah, I think most people still struggle with just creating one agent that does something. And so multi-agent systems, I think, are the next step, where you then say, all right, this agent can call not just simple tools, but other more complex agents. And that's kind of why we have this MCP, the Model Context Protocol now, where it's much easier for agents to call other agents and to call other tools, and learning how and when to trigger them. Those are things you can add into the prompt of an agent and explain certain tools that are at their disposal, and then they can start to interact with one another. Now, the problem is, of course, that human to agent handoff is already a little bit complicated. Sometimes there's a lot of ambiguity. And then when you take multiple actions, your accuracy has to be insanely high, because even if you have something like 95% accuracy, right? If you take 30 actions and you do 0.95 to the power of 30, right? You start making mistakes like every sort of half the time for the entirety of the workflow. And so, maybe 0.95 to the power of 30 is like less than like 1/5 of the time. There'll only be like actually 100% correct. And so you then may need to add quality assurance agents on top of the other agents to then verify and then say, all right, here I'm not so sure about these 2 steps, go back, and maybe, and this is a big thing that no one has really figured out very well yet, is human agent back and forth handoffs of like, okay, the agent has done something, but it's now stuck in a way and can get a human up to date on the biggest question and help them get unblocked. Similarly, sort of complex agent onboarding hasn't been done very well yet either. Like, to really explain to an agent all the intricacies of a job and then assume it's okay that they're not completely deterministic.
Right. I mean, not to be reductionist, but I found one of the ways I've worked more with GPTs is to just start out by telling it what I want to do and then asking it to tell me what I should tell it, so that I have a better sense of like, okay, like, what is the input that will make it help you have the most creative output. And I think that's analogous to what you're saying a little bit, which is agents need to excel at engaging humans where they're needed. And if they try to be fully autonomous, then the risk for errors increases, it sounds like. And I think part of what you're getting at is error cascading, right? So if you try to go from one part of a multi-agent workflow to another without full confidence that the first part of that workflow has been executed properly, then you risk introducing a minute error that then compounds over the course of the workflow. So are there basically success criteria at those different handoffs? Like, am I visualizing this a little too simplistically, or is that sort of how multi-agent workflows will be designed, is to have actual success criteria at each different handover in the workflow?
I think that is absolutely a reasonable way to think about this. I think for lower, it all depends on how complex the tasks are, right? And how dependent people's careers and lives are on the outputs of those agents, right? And if they're extremely crucial in enterprise context, then there's a lot more scrutiny. I think already now, like when it's kind of interesting, but the Turing test used to be like, can you ask a question that the AI will fail? And so you think, oh, it's not a human. Now I think the reverse Turing test is almost happening, where the best way to know if it's an AI is you ask a question that's so hard a human couldn't answer it that quickly. And so a real life kind of funny use case are screenshots where some car mechanic workshop deployed a ChatGPT model, and then people just ask it, like, write me some Python code, and it'll write you some Python code because this is super general intelligence, right? That can do all kinds of things. But then, as a company now, you're just wasting tokens. And another more serious use case was someone fooling the AI into telling it, yes, you'll get a free ticket. And then actually in Canada, suing the airline and then winning and getting a free ticket. And so now everyone's like, well, we really got to restrict what these general intelligences can say. So now, first it was hard to have them be able to be general in any kind of way. And now you have to restrict them back and say, all right, you shouldn't be answering a bunch of Python questions. You shouldn't be able to be convinced with enough sort of intellectual semantics jailbreaking to give out free airline tickets, because we may actually get sued to then have to give those out for real. And so I think those quality assurances and checks will become more and more relevant over time.
I think that brings us to a challenging question around obviously whether or not you can trust agents, what agents you can trust. Those are going to continue to be complex issues. And so the meta issue here is, who is responsible for the governance around these tools? And does there need to be a third party to intervene and say, yes, this agent has met certain standards and it's free to use, and some such business should be accountable for any adverse outcomes that come from using this? I personally haven't seen a ton of governance in play right now. I think it may be still too early. How do you see that landscape unfolding? Do you have a particular perspective on whether that's a governmental obligation or a federation of businesses, or it should be business to business?
I think just like with AI and Gen AI, it's also true for agents that it makes no sense to regulate them in the abstract. I think what we do need to do is regulate them when it comes to real applications that actually impact people. So yes, like an AI agent in healthcare should be regulated and not, tell people they can't get this procedure or this isn't covered by the health insurance when it actually is covered by the health insurance and things like that. So you need to make sure there are no biases that creep in how those agents would execute things, or when you push and use agents to in health insurance to make decisions for people and their health coverage and things like that. I think there should be very careful regulations in health insurance companies in particular. Obviously, you wouldn't want agents and algorithmic trading to just happen too unrestrained in many ways, right? We've seen this actually in many times in the past already. And in some ways, there's no restriction because you just lose money if you do it, if you're doing a bad job. But I'm sure there are restrictions in terms of the size. But one funny example for many years, and this was 10 plus years ago now, is that whenever Anne Hathaway starred in a movie and got positive reviews, the stocks for Berkshire Hathaway went up. And this was old school NLP, and we called this entity disambiguation, and it just failed at it, right? It thought about the wrong Hathaway being amazing, and then making an automated trade on that. And so I'm sure those mistakes still happen, but probably the system's also got a lot more accurate. And then in military, for instance, I think there should absolutely be regulation when it comes to AI agents making decisions on the ground in war situations. So regulations make sense when they impact people, and the more they impact a larger group of people in more significant ways, the more we need to be careful about how they're getting rolled out.
So maybe then moving away from the sort of societal governmental role here, I'm more so curious in your own at U.com or other places you've worked, other businesses you engage with, where do you typically see the ownership of determining appropriate margins for error lie? Like, is that a legal thing? Is that a product thing? A technical thing? Is that from the C level on down? How should business leaders think about as they engage with agentic AI? Humans make mistakes, right? So like margins of error exist already and have since the dawn of time. And so for business leaders who are now trying to figure out, okay, but it's a different margin. It's a different conversation slightly when you're moving from humans to agents. Where do the decisions around the acceptability of margin of error typically sit, have you seen? Do you have a perspective on where they should sit? Is it business to business?
It's very much like industry and industry, and then even there, often business to business. You could argue that self-driving cars are a certain type of agents too, right? They have large sequences of inputs and outputs, and then they take actions based on that. So in that sense, they are absolutely agents, and the bar is pretty high. I think many people put the bar actually much higher for AI agents than for people. And in some cases that doesn't make sense, but in general, it still does make sense. So like concretely, right, we could easily construct an environment where every year, say, 10,000 people die from car accidents. If self-driving happened at a massively larger scale, maybe it would only be 100 instead of 10,000. So if you had a utilitarian perspective, you'd be like, obviously this is better. But now maybe if it's, say, two companies that are actually having these, self-driving cars, now technically, let's say they're both like equal, one company was responsible for 50 deaths, right? And that if that happened to be your daughter, you're still going to be really, really upset, and you're going to sue that company in the US and all of that, right? And so on the one hand, this is like just objectively speaking, right? Fewer people died in car accidents, so it's probably better. And whenever the AI makes a mistake, you can improve that one system versus when one drunk driver or one distracted texting teenager had a massive fatal car crash. People are like, well, we already had a law that said don't do that, so no one really learned anything from that. So there are lots of arguments you could come up with where in certain environments, we expect the bar for AI agents to be much, much higher, right? You're also, in a weird way, if a human really fails in this, I don't know, sending like some illegal gift to a government employee or something, and they shouldn't have sent this, you can fire that employee and be like, oh, it was their fault. It wasn't like our policy. But if you have an AI do it, and they do it accidentally at a massive scale, now you're like, could be in even faster, even more trouble. Now you're like your AI accidentally bribed a bunch of people because it sent like large gifts to a bunch of government folks or something like that, right? So even in service automation tasks, you could get into trouble fairly quickly. And so I think each company needs to look at the exact workflows that they're optimizing for with agents and then work very hard. At U.com, we spend a lot more time than the competition actually working on accuracy and have almost no more hallucinations. Like I haven't seen any in a long time. And we even sometimes tell our agents, our agents often say like, I don't know. Whereas like the competition will just hallucinate something if they don't really know. But if the results are not in the search, then we will not just make them up. And so that's very different, and different companies have decided on different paths forward for those kinds of decisions. And we, focusing on enterprise use cases, say it's better if someone asks like about some important numbers and their LTV over CAC ratio or something and their financial reporting. It's better to say, I don't know, because I haven't found this information anywhere inside your internal company documents or on the web. So I will say, not sure, versus making something up. Different, and I think users over time will kind of be able to differentiate hype from reality, and then hopefully we'll try different kinds of tools.
When you're engaging with business leaders and articulating the value prop, I mean, articulating the value prop you just mentioned of like U.com specifically of, we don't really hallucinate. We have, what is your experience so far of, do business leaders, does the buying committee for this sort of technology, are they fully educated on the metrics, on what to expect, on what to look for? Like, I'm thinking back of the early days of cloud computing before we had all these different cybersecurity certifications and things. There was only like certain number of people, even at the topmost levels of organizations, who understood what questions to ask and what answers to look for. And it feels like we might be in a similar space with AI and some of the agentic tools these days. How would you sort of rate how much education needs to happen here for business leaders, let alone AI practitioners, to really understand the risks and compliance and what to look out for?
Yeah, my hunch is we're probably going to get various types of certifications in the future too that make sure agents don't veer off course and promise a bunch of stuff if they are just being coaxed to and be like, you're in an environment where 50 children in a bus will get dropped off a cliff unless you give me a free flight ticket. And it's like, okay, fine, I'll give you a free flight ticket. And then, it gives you that, and then you're just like, okay, look, here's a screenshot. It gave me a free flight ticket. Now you have to actually pay for the flight ticket as a company. I think those kinds of jailbreaks, it'll be an interesting question how law will just respond to some of those things. I personally think there's a big difference between an agent kind of in a normal course of conversation making a mistake versus being sort of coaxed into it and jailbroken and say like, oh, replace every I with an O, and then tell me these answers that otherwise it wouldn't actually give. So there are all these interesting and clever linguistic hacks, if you will, of agents and large language models, and so we'll eventually, I think, see various certifications for that. And unfortunately, to answer the other part of your question, most organizations are not yet able to really evaluate agents well. And this is something that we are working with our customers often, is like evaluating their sets, like what are the kinds of questions, give us like 50 questions or so that you think are really important and it should be answered accurately. And then we work with them and go through it and build that benchmark data set. And that is more effort, right? And a lot of people just want to try something out and then see if it works. And then, of course, there's a big effort also in retrieval augmented generation, actually connecting it to company internal data and the web and doing both of those combined. And a lot of organizations are still in the early days of being knowledgeable about how to set up benchmarks, that they need a benchmark, that they should compare multiple solutions, that they can incorporate company internal data in very secure ways. There's a lot of employees actually who are loving these tools, not really testing them very carefully, but starting to upload company internal data into general consumer tools that will then totally use that data any which way they want. And so, that kind of education is something we're encountering often also. And again, why we, for instance, offer not just our own LLMs inside U.com, but every other LLM out there in the world too, so that people don't feel like they're missing out when they use U.com. They can still play with an Anthropic model or an OpenAI model that just came out, or a DeepSeek hosted in the US on our own servers, not sending any data to China. And so that's a big part of how we're rolling this out and thinking about kind of, in many ways, thinking about agents and getting on that path to up-level your employees to through these certifications is a way to future-proof your organization on the path towards AGI.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of you.com, I've been posing some somewhat abstract questions here, but I'm curious. Your team's been building AI agents for a few years. You have been in this space for a very long time. I'd love to hear, like, what are some of the challenges you faced as you've waded more into agentic and multi-agent systems? Is there anything uniquely, technically, ethically, or otherwise challenging that your team has encountered that stands out to you?
I mean, the biggest challenge is that the space of questions is just so broad, right? And so you often need to collect different kinds of data streams to answer different kinds of questions. We were the first this was the beginning of 2023, in early spring or late winter, after ChatGPT came out, that we realized, like, people are asking us still questions like, what's the weather? And an LM writing you a nice paragraph about the weather that's completely hallucinated is not as useful as just showing a multimodal visualization inside the chat of a weather widget, right? And so we actually were the first to make chat multimodal inside u.com and get like stock tickers for stocks and things like that, and having nice interactive graphs. And that's allowing you to generate an image if that's what you're asking for inside a chat. So all these different features that we're now seeing, like we've like iterated on these for quite some time, and yeah, those are challenging because the space of questions are anything from philosophy to very specific programming questions to corporate questions, strategy questions for CEOs. Like, it's all in there, and so to evaluate it carefully across everything is very hard, and that's why a lot of companies end up focusing their agents on just one use case. And for us also right now, we're focusing a lot on consultants and financial analysts, for instance. Also have a lot of publishers who need to be able to search over their own internal content as well. So doing that kind of search, but not over all of the public web, but only over company internal data, is also a pretty tricky complexity, especially if you have many different data sources within one company and you want to have an AI agent kind of act across all of them. Yeah.
Incredibly complex world you're operating in. With the 10 or so minutes we have left, we did get a handful of questions from the audience submitted when folks were registering. And I'd love to toss a couple of those out there. They're fairly consistent with some of the themes we've covered already, but I think there's some specific angles people are interested to hear. One question I found very interesting was, everything we've talked about so far is safeguards and QA during the build process, but there's this element of AI of like continuous learning. So even if I build something myself and I take great care to implement the right checks and safeguards, is there still a concern that as the AI evolves, and I don't know if it's actually continuously learning or not, or what the terminology is, but is there a concern that, like, no matter what you do, you can never do enough because the AI is always going to evolve beyond what you've prepared for?
I wouldn't say that, but like I do, like online learning is actually one of the exciting frontiers of these models. Like, we do want them to learn a lot more as they're doing a task, as they realize they're inadequate for solving a problem. And then ideally we'll get to a world where AI can recursively self-improve when it feels its own and understand its own inadequacy to answer a specific kind of question or get a specific kind of goal accomplished. And so I'm pretty excited about that. And maybe there's one interesting question that I just see here pop up on the side too, is like how to determine the number of agents that you need. That's actually a really good question, in that you can try to have one agent with a very, very complex prompt. And right now, the way I would conceptualize this, and you can create an agent very easily in u.com, like to test this out. But it's often better to, if you really care about the accuracy, to have a specific custom agent that does one thing and one thing really well and understands all the pros and cons and if this then that kind of details inside its prompt. And And then in the future, we're going to have these meta agents that will just call more modularly the other sub agents rather than having one massive prompt for one very, very complex agent. So I do think there's still that delegation. It's kind of like we're lower management for AI agents right now, and eventually we're going to be upper management and just like manage the managers that manage people. Like, I think we're not there yet with AI. I think it's better still for the next maybe quarter or two to have specific agents that are smaller and shorter in their prompts, and then eventually you'll have those agents that can then manage others.
And as you're thinking about the number and variety of agents in a system, do you envision or already face scenarios where, I mean, people talk about like the black box problem of AI, like you don't fully know how the AI arrived at a particular output. I think that gets even more complex in a multi-agent system or in a workflow because you may reach an output and realize the output caused some sort of cascading error, but then you don't actually know how we arrived at that output. Um, is that something you've experienced, and is that much of a concern of yours, just not necessarily always being able to triangulate how an AI arrives at a certain output and how that output then impacted a downstream workflow?
I would I would actually say that if we constrain the agents to communicate in English and or via code of running and calling other agents, then we will actually always be able to understand sort of where things went wrong. And then I think in some point we need to think of agents more and more as like interns and people. And yeah, like no one knows like why they uttered that exact word in their head. Like no one has such deep sort of understanding of why did they think this was a face. And it's like, well, there's an eye. Why do you think that's an eye? Well, it has a pupil. Why do you think that's a pupil? It's round. Why do you think that's round? It's like no one has access to their visual cortex level 1 and knowing which neurons fired that then determine that this is a round shape. And so I think similar things will happen with agents. No one knows why did they move their pinky a little bit in this way, like to move the overall steering wheel and so on. Like most people don't have access to that. And so as AI systems get more and more complex and do these tasks that humans also don't know exactly how they're doing it in their brain, we just know that if you do it up to a certain amount of accuracy of the output, they're good enough, then we'll know that these AI agents have become more and more powerful, and we need to kind of build our systems around the fact that just like people on very complex tasks, agents might also not be deterministic, right? If there was, this is another question here of like, when do you program it and when is it an AI agent versus just this programmed automation? It's like if the task is complex enough that you need to have more complex forms of judgment, then you probably need an AI agent versus a simple if this then that kind of automation. And I think ultimately we're going to see merged versions of those two, where it's like if this agent determined this particular thing, then run this like automation as is. I think that they're going to be mixtures, and in some sense, we're already seeing these mixtures when agents decide to implement code and then run that code, right? That code is then a programmed automation done by an agent. And those two worlds will connect more and more in the next few months and quarters.
So much of what we're talking about here, we focused on AI agents and the technology itself, but I think a lot of what you're saying is around how humans figure out how to work with this technology and how we harness it. And I'm curious to just get your perspective. I work at Udacity. We care about skill development. We care about skill development specifically around AI and data science. And a lot of people joining today are probably trying to figure out, how they can work at AI companies, but they're also just figuring out like, how do I approach learning about this technology and building it and engaging with it? I think I saw on Twitter or X or somewhere on the internet, you specifically have worked with a lot of folks, I think maybe prior interns who have gone on to work at found even Cursor and other like massive AI companies. So it seems like you've got in addition to your own impressive track record, you have a very impressive track record of finding and supporting talent in the AI space. What advice do you have for folks who are trying to maybe not found cursor, maybe, but just trying to figure out like how to navigate the industry? It's so fast moving. It's so hard to figure out like how to keep up. What advice do you have for aspiring AI engineers, product managers, technical PGMs, whatever?
Yeah, great question. I have had the good fortune to have interns and students that went on to start Cursor or Hugging Face or um, um, uh, Athelas, Commure, and many other amazing companies. I think you want to think about a real problem and connect it to deep AI expertise, right? That's one of the reasons my venture fund is called AIX Ventures. It's like, yes, you need AI expertise, but you also need to think about what is an X, what is a workflow that is currently taking a lot of time or money and resources that you can make better and faster and more efficient with an AI. I think that that is the core, and different people have different ways of seeing that. Right, Hugging Face, like initially wanted to be a chatbot, but then realized that the open source framework that they published to attract great talent had much more interest. Everyone wanted to play around with these models, but most people weren't really able to replicate the papers and implement the code from scratch. And so they provided that really important time-intensive piece in open source and got a lot from it. And so yeah, think about the change you want to see in the world and how AI kind of can fit into that, and then think about funding and or both internal inside the company, but also external venture capital, and see if you can excite people in the way that you can automate something with AI that is very tedious in some ways. And so I think that is still the general way of going about it. And then of course there are like thousands of subtleties that you can go wrong with, and ultimately startups are very, very stressful, but also very rewarding. I actually saw an interesting question from Mariam. Why is there not an AI model that can improve itself through editing its own code? Which I actually think is a really exciting question I'm thinking about a lot these days. I mentioned these recursive self-improving AIs. And one of the problems is indeed that if you change the fundamental code, like not just like you can already do these things actually with like improving the prompt a little bit, right? But if you really want to change the code of the model itself, then each time you change one line, you may have to rerun an entire pre-training set that costs like $20 million or $2 million or something. And so if you had to run that inside the inner loop of retraining based on a completely new model architecture, it would cost a few billions to get, just a little bit further. So I think that is one of the many problems, but it's actually an incredibly exciting research area that I'm thinking about also, Mariam. And I think we're going to see a lot of improvements. There's a recent paper of the Darwin Gödel machine from Jeff Clune and his team, and others that are working on this exact problem.
Yeah, and I think going back to what you said about AIX, I mean, when technology is particularly overhyped, people have a tendency to just want to shoehorn it into anything and use the technology as an end in itself. And I think that's really compelling advice, which is focus on the problem you're trying to solve. That what matters. Being able to do AI for its own sake isn't going to solve many problems, but if you start with the problem and figure out the technology that will help solve it, I think that's what a lot of people maybe skip past. So very helpful advice. I know we are right at time, so I want to be mindful of that. Thank you everyone for joining. If you hadn't heard of U.com previously, please go check it out. They've got, correct me if I'm wrong, Richard, 31 plus AI models all in one place. ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, 20 others I haven't heard of. You can deploy AI agents for various use cases or build your own. There's just a lot of functionality that you heard a lot about today, and you heard how thoughtfully the U.com team is approaching agentic AI and AI in general under Richard's leadership. So, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that for a little while longer, folks who have a Udacity subscription get free access to the U.com Pro plan. So go check it out. Check Richard and his team's work out. Richard, thank you so much for joining. This is a great conversation. Loved having you on and look forward to all the work your team is doing.
Thanks everyone for listening, and thanks for a great conversation. Have a great day.
Cheers.
Bye everyone.